And will you step into the witness box and raise your right hand so that you can be sworn?
Move for submission now, please.
Matter of housekeeping, I did have the exhibit for Dr. Jose. It's his CV. I neglected to move to admit it while he was on the stand. We provided it to opposing counsel before trial started, long before trial started. If there's no objection, I move to admit it.
It's cumulative, Your Honor, and I had objected to it before.
I'm sorry, what?
He said it's cumulative.
It's cumulative, Your Honor, and I objected to it before, I think, when it was listed.
I think it's also hearsay, actually, so the objection is sustained.
Very good.
Mary Staton, M-A-R-Y-S-T-A-T-O-N.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ms. Staton, good afternoon. Is it Staton?
Staton, yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions in this case. You are, just state your name, please, for the court and jury.
Mary Staton.
And in addition, or before you were a jailer, are you still a jailer?
Yes, I am.
You were actually a nurse's aide for 6 years, I understand, correct?
Yes.
So you have some knowledge of sick people, correct?
A little, yes.
Huh?
A little, yes.
A little. For 6 years. And of course, so we can understand where you're coming from, you're claiming that you couldn't recognize that a dying man who was locked in a cell in front of you was dying or was sick. That's your claim, right?
He was confused, sir. I thought he had mental health problems.
Well, I've heard that before, but I want to know, I've been hearing that the entire time of this trial, but you're claiming that a dying man didn't look sick.
Is he allowed to give editorial comments, or should he just ask questions?
She's an Evers party. He can take some liberties. Go ahead.
Thank you. And again, I just want to get an answer. Are you claiming that a man who was dying of pneumococcal pneumonia, of sepsis, and of meningitis didn't look sick?
In the morning, no, he did not look it.
Well, I'm talking about, you were there the whole day.
He stayed in his room for the rest of the day.
No, he was locked in, wasn't he?
He could have came out if he wanted to. He had to push the button.
You didn't know that his brain had been affected, and he couldn't make those determinations?
No, sir, I did not.
Well, no, you saw him in the morning. He couldn't even figure out how to get into his own room, so you had to call 2 deputies to guide him into his room, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that would have given you kind of a hint that something's wrong with his ability to understand what's going on, didn't it?
We have mental health people that we do have to help into their rooms.
Okay, now, my question is, that gave you some idea that something was wrong. Now, you keep telling me you have people that, I'm not talking about anybody but Mr. Bruner. Were you talking about somebody else?
No, I
Okay.
do not know Mr. Bruner till that day.
So when you see Mr. Bruner, and people told you during that day he hadn't eaten for days, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
When you see Mr. Bruner walking dazed, confused, and can't get into his room and closes the door 3 times, you said to yourself, gee, I've seen that before. I'll just get somebody to put him in there and lock him in, right? Is that what you said to yourself?
Early in the morning, and I just had him put in his room so I could finish the linen that I was doing.
See, but that isn't what you normally do, because you testified under oath in this case on page 20 at line 9. If we see somebody acting a little strange, I will call ConMed and say, hey, check out this guy. Right?
Yes.
Now, you didn't know, and this is in evidence, it's your position that you didn't know that Mr. Bruner had been transferred from Staton to Sedgwick on the 5th, 5 days before you see him, because he was weak, not eating, and he had blood in his stools. You didn't know that, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. And of course, you didn't know, because you had already left and turned him over to the next shift, that when he was finally brought down to the clinic after being in your care since 7 o'clock, he was unalert, unresponsive to painful stimuli. His abdomen was distended, he was jaundiced, and he was unable to walk. You, of course, didn't know that, even though he had been under your care for the entire day, right?
No, I didn't know that.
Right. So somehow, he suddenly, right after you left, he suddenly got sick, right?
No, I did not. We were waiting for mental health to come down to see him.
You claim suddenly, after you left, he got sick, and he was perfectly looked good for all the 8 hours that you were there, right?
Didn't say that, sir.
So he did, are you saying he did look sick?
No,
Okay.
he did not come out of his room.
Now, my understanding also in Pod 1 is the people are monitored even more closely in Pod 1 than they are in the rest of the jail. Isn't that true?
We marred them all about the same.
And by the way, Your Honor, at this time I want to move for admission of, I believe it's proposed Exhibit 6, which is I don't believe there's any objection, Sedgwick County Detention Center's EMS run sheet.
Is there any objection? Exhibit 6 is received.
Thank you very much. Now, when the EMS finally came and got him, and now this is after you've left the jail, it says the patient was growing, but I believe that's groaning, hot skin, distended abdomen with yellow skin. Now that, of course, you didn't see any of that, did you?
No, sir.
When did he turn yellow?
I do not know, sir.
But it was right after you left, right? Because upon arrival to the clinic, which I guess everybody says is about 4 o'clock, which is within an hour of you leaving, he was yellow. So you claim he turned yellow after you left, right?
Sir, I do not know. He never did come out of his cell.
Your job is to watch him and check his well-being at least once an hour, every hour. Strike that. Are you claiming that Mr. Bruner was hiding in his cell and you couldn't check his well-being?
I did. I called my rover in one time when somebody said that he was laying down. I had my rover go and check on him.
Was he resting? Maybe he was like taking a nap. He had been up watching TV and walking around. He was just laying down, right?
I do not know, sir. I can't look in his cell where I was sitting.
So you didn't know, and your rover didn't tell you he was laying in a fetal position in garbage.
When he came, after he went and checked on him, he came into and said that Mr. Bruner was not doing good. So I
Not doing good, but I said you didn't know that he was laying in a fetal position, basically unresponsive and garbage?
I don't recall.
I see, you don't recall. So how long did you immediately then call for medical help to come down there for an emergency and help a man who was in that condition?
I called Sergeant Martinez.
No, I didn't ask you that. I said if you called medical help to immediately come down and see him, that's your job.
No, I called Sergeant Martinez and let him know and asked him, and he said he was going to get a hold of mental health.
So you're blaming Sergeant Martinez for not calling medical help?
In my report, it says right there in my report that I called Sergeant Martinez and let him know of the situation.
I understand that, but you're blaming him for not calling the medical.
No, I'm just saying what is in my report.
Well, I wasn't asking you what was in your report. I'm asking you if did you know that he was laying in garbage in a fetal position? Or you just thought he wasn't doing well?
I do not recall.
You do not recall. Okay. Now, this is in evidence. It's Exhibit 2. A deputy who you called to come and help Mr. Bruner, who couldn't get into his cell. Correct? This is Mr. Murphy. We heard from him yesterday.
Yes.
I want to be clear. You're sitting in the pod, right? And you're looking right at him. Mr. Bruner's just a few feet from you, right? Just a few feet. You're sitting here looking out, and he's right over there. Just a few feet away from you, isn't he?
Yes.
And you say he's not yellow. He turned yellow. I just want to be clear. This man is not yellow. He turned yellow when you left, right?
I do not recall when he turned or anything like that. I was busy getting people out for linen exchange.
Well, when
in
he
the
was,
morning.
I'm sure, when he was standing in front of you, and let me understand, he was standing in front of the door, and he kept closing it, and you kept opening it, and he closed it, and you opened it again, and he closed it again, and he couldn't apparently figure out how to walk into his cell, right?
Yes.
So you called 2 male deputies who came and walked him into the cell to lock it, right?
Yes, I called.
And you asked Sergeant Martinez, rather than to get him help, according to Sergeant Martinez, you asked Sergeant Martinez to lock him down and don't let him out.
I do not recall that.
Okay. And then, of course, so when Mr. Murphy says in the morning that inmate Brewer looked confused and was walking around the section while staring at the ground, you saw that same thing, right? Right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we heard from Sergeant Johnson-Wootson. You know her.
Yes.
She's a young lady, was here several days ago. Remember her testimony? This is also an Exhibit 2. And within an hour after leaving your care, she saw him in the clinic, moaning loudly, breathing appeared to be labored. He appeared to be incoherent and lethargic and did not acknowledge me. Now, none of that existed the hour or the 8 hours before, did it? This all happened just when he got to the clinic, right?
Sir, this is when the EMS came to pick him up.
No, actually, this is when she entered the clinic and he had just arrived. and I believe he was still in the wheelchair, or very closely. So this would have been approximately within an hour. Maybe you're right, I'm reading it now. You think he became incoherent, labored breathing, lethargic while he was laying in the clinic, but he was okay while you saw him. I don't want to misrepresent anything. Is that what your position is?
When I saw him, I didn't see much of him because I was still busy letting inmates in and out for linen exchange. I was trying to get him back in his room and getting other inmates in their room.
He was under your care and defendant's Jameson care from 7 o'clock till 3 o'clock, wasn't he?
Yes.
And then you turned him over to the next deputy, Tong, and your statement to him was, Bruner's not doing good. Wasn't that your words?
I don't recall what I said to him.
Well, you wrote it, didn't you, in the log? Bruner not doing good.
No, that was Deputy Tong that wrote that in the log.
Okay, and you told him that?
I do not recall. I probably called him that mental health is coming down to see him.
Okay. Now, you also heard from Mr. Hunt, another deputy, okay, who went into the cell while you were still there and he was under your care. Do you remember Mr. Hunt? Do you?
Yes, I know.
Okay. He saw Mr. Bruner while you were there and he was under your care, sitting on his bunk and rocking his body and moaning. You didn't know that, did you?
I don't think I was there at that time when Deputy Hunt came in.
Oh, you had already left because he arrived with a wheelchair and you had left already. Right?
I think I have already left by then.
So, do you think that Mr. Bruner began sitting on his bunk and rocking his body and moaning just right after you left, but he was perfectly okay in the 8 hours before that? Do you think that?
I don't know what happened.
Now, he said, of course, that he picked him up and put him into a chair, and Mr. Bruner was very sweaty. His jumpsuit was soiled with sweat. I noticed he had vomited on the floor. All of that happened after you left, right?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. And then, of course, you know Deputy Jones.
Yes.
Deputy Jones did see him when he was in the clinic with Nurse Sharon, who said she took his vital signs just before 6 o'clock. And she said he didn't want to keep his arm in place. He kept trying to sit up, so I had to keep putting my hand on his shoulder. The inmate appeared to be in pain. His eyes were crusty from dried discharge. He was moaning and didn't look well. Of course, he was perfectly fine when you were taking care of him in the previous 8 hours, correct?
He was, sir, the only thing I can tell you, he was in his room. He didn't come back out. That's the only time I saw him was in the morning.
And, of course, you heard from Miss Skelton, who went in there with Lisa Armstrong. Were you still there when Miss Skelton and Lisa Armstrong came down and did a courtesy call after 3 o'clock?
I don't recall if I was still there when they came in.
Now, Miss Skelton testified here in this case that he looked very ill, and she immediately knew he needed medical care. But you couldn't see that, could you?
No, I can't see him in his room.
You couldn't see anything, right? Even though it's your job to protect their health and welfare. You couldn't see it, right?
I couldn't see his room, no.
Even when you did rounds to check on his welfare, you couldn't see it, right?
I don't recall if I did rounds or not.
So you don't recall, even though you're required to do at least 8 rounds, you don't recall if you ever did them, right?
Sir, on Monday mornings in Pod 1, it's very busy.
Now, and I want to make it clear, you didn't know, according to Mr. Jameson, that he was laying on the floor in a pile of trash, curled up in a fetal position, relatively unresponsive. You didn't know that either, right?
I don't recall what Mr. Jameson told me when he came in. I know I got a hold of Sergeant Martinez afterwards, but I don't recall what Jameson said to me.
Okay, and of course, you never heard him, like the inmates have said, coughing and hacking and vomiting. You never saw that, right? Or heard that, right?
No, not from the booth, we don't.
So in light of your experience and your training, just in terms of you being a nurse's assistant, how did this happen? How did you miss a dying man being sick?
Sir, I did not know he was sick.
I guess my question isn't good. How did you not see what was there to be seen?
I saw somebody confused, walking around confused. I thought he needed to be seen by mental health.
You wrote a statement on 3/11, correct?
Yes.
Were you aware that he was, did you write it on 3/11?
Yes, I did.
So you must have known something bad had happened to Mr. Bruner, right?
I don't recall. I just know one of my supervisors asked me to write a report on him.
You
What
didn't
happened
know.
the day before.
Sure, I cut you off. I apologize.
I just said I didn't know. One of my supervisors asked me to write a report of what happened the day before.
You didn't know that he, at that time, was laying in Via Christi Hospital, brain dead, and on a ventilator from bacterial meningitis.
I don't recall if they said anything in a squad meeting.
Nobody told you that, right? Let me ask you this. Did anybody ever come and ask you, how did this man get so sick right after he saw you, but you claim he didn't look sick while he was under your care? Did anybody come and ask you that question?
Not that I recall, no.
Deputy Staton was assigned Pod 1. This is your writing. Approximately 7:15, deputies were coming into the pod for linen exchange. As we was doing Section C, I let downstairs inmates out. So that's inmate Brewer came out of his cell without his linen. He walked over to the bookshelf under the stairs. I bang on the window to get inmate Bruner attention. Inmates was coming back into the section from the gym. Some of the inmates said to inmate Bruner to get his linen for linen exchange. I'd like to stop right there for a second. Do you recall a number of inmates coming up to you throughout the day and say, please get this man help, he's sick?
The only one, like on my report, I saw that one inmate came up and told me he wasn't eating.
So you do recall inmates coming to you, telling you, get this man help, he's sick?
In my report, I only had the one.
No, I'm asking you, aside from your report, do you recall numerous inmates, including Mr. Ewells, Mr. Snyder, and others coming up to you saying, help this man, he's sick?
I don't remember if other people came up or not.
Do you remember saying to them, he's faking?
No.
Now, you don't remember, or it didn't happen?
I don't recall other inmates coming up and saying anything about it.
So they were just coming up to talk to you about him not eating, but they weren't telling you that he was sick, or that they were worried about him, or that he needed help. They just were saying, he's not eating. Is that it?
I don't recall if they came up and said anything else or not. The only thing I can remember from my report and all that, they said that he hadn't been eating for a couple of days.
So you knew he hadn't been eating.
But we have inmates that don't eat a lot.
Sure. So because you have inmates that you've seen walk around confused, you have inmates that haven't eaten. Mr. Bruner, as far as you were concerned, didn't need any help, because you've seen something. I guess you've seen something before. That means Mr. Bruner doesn't get help, right?
No, I called mental health to find out so they could come down and see him.
Well, actually, you called them in the morning, and they told you, we don't come around, even do rounds, till after 3 o'clock. And you said, okay, no problem. Right?
I let them know, and they said they do rounds later. I said, okay.
Right. So you weren't trying to get him any help, because that was going to be after you left. Right?
No, I called mental health to let them know about him.
Inmate Brewer went to his cell. I hit the stitch to open his door a couple of times. What's that? Is that the thing that opens the door?
It's a switch.
The switch. It's not a stitch.
Yeah.
I called into the gym and asked some deputies to come and help inmate Brewer into his room, into his cell. Why did you want him in his cell?
Because we were still doing a linen exchange.
So why did you want him in his cell? He wasn't hurting anybody.
Because when we do a linen exchange, everybody goes back to their cell until we are done with linen exchange.
But he hadn't. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Once we are done with linen exchange, we let them out for showers and razors.
But he never came out for a shower and a razor, did he?
Not that I recall.
He never came out with his linen, did he?
No.
Why didn't you help him get linen? The man, you knew he didn't come, he was walking around aimlessly. He didn't come out with his linen. Why didn't you just help him get the linen, if you cared?
I don't recall. I probably was going to get linen when I went on my break or something for him.
Well, you didn't.
We do a lot.
How come you didn't?
I don't recall.
Deputy Murphy and Jameson came into Section C and helped inmate Brewer into his cell. Inmate Brewer went in with no problems, and I left him in the cell for the morning. And then you called Sergeant Martinez and said, I want to lock him in there for the rest of the day, right?
No.
So when Sergeant Martinez wrote that in his report and testified to that, he was mistaken? Is that your claim?
No.
Well, did you want to lock him in his cell, or didn't you?
Probably the thing is I was letting Sergeant Martinez know what was happening, what happened in the morning with him, and that he didn't change linen and all that. That if they do not change linen, per policy, they're locked down for 72 hours.
So you wanted to lock him down into his cell for 3 days?
I don't
For being
recall
too
asking.
sick, for being, let me finish my question. For being too sick to get his linen, you were going to put him in his cell for 72 hours.
I don't recall asking Martinez for that, though.
Okay, here it is. It's in evidence. she advised that inmate Bruner did not participate with linen exchange and wanted to lock him down. And thank you for telling me that's for 72 hours, 3 days. That's you, right?
I don't recall asking Lieutenant or Sergeant Martinez.
So you left him in the cell the rest of the morning, a man who couldn't get it in, and you never checked up on him, according to you, even though you do hourly rounds. Correct?
If we get a rover in there, we can get rounds done.
Inmate Brat Snyder came to the booth and told me that he was not eating any of the food since he came into the pod. Well, that would be 4 days. Did you know that?
If you read after, as I said, I looked it up. I looked up.
And he came into the pod on 3/6 from out of the county. So 3/6, 3/7, 3/8, 3/9, 3/10. So it was 4 or 5 days he hadn't eaten, according to inmate Snyder. What did you tell him? You immediately went over to Mr. Bruner and said, "Can I help you? Is something wrong? You haven't eaten for 5 days." You did that, right?
No, I don't recall doing that.
At approximately 10:25, Sergeant Martinez came into the pod. I told him inmate Brewer and how he was at linen exchange and him not eating. So you knew by 10:25 that he hadn't been eating for 5 days, right?
It shows on my report, yes.
Now, you don't recall telling Sergeant Martinez you wanted to lock him down for 3 days, but you said Sergeant Martinez said to get a hold of mental health. You called up there and said, "Could you make a courtesy call?" And they told you we wouldn't be down till after 3 o'clock, right?
I asked him to come down and check on him, and I probably told him that he hadn't been eating.
I talked to Andrea, and she said she'll come down in the afternoon, after 3 o'clock, which is what they did, right?
All it is, she said, was afternoon. Doesn't give me a time or nothing, just afternoons when they do their rounds.
Approximately 11:50, Chow came into the pod. The pod worker for Section C, inmate Bamadelli, told me, that's the second one, that inmate Brewer had not been eating. So this is the second person who told you that now, right?
Yes.
Now, these people, of course, weren't telling you he's sick, he needs help, he's not eating. They just wanted to let you know he's not eating, but they didn't tell you anything else, right?
Not that I recall.
Okay. I asked him to take a tray to Bruner. When everyone was done eating, I had inmate Uganbayoyi go and get the tray from Bruner's cell and show it to me. And inmate Bruner did not touch anything, and I logged that he didn't eat. So now you've known that he hasn't eaten for 5 days. It's lunch. It's before noon. For sure, you immediately went to Mr. Bruner's cell where he was locked in and said, "Can I help you?" Right?
I had nobody to relieve me, so I could go see him. Right.
And who did you ask to go in to check on him?
I'll be asking my rover if he came back in. But he's busy doing his stuff.
So what you're saying is he was just ignored to death, Mr. Bruner. This was just, we was busied to death.
Mr. Bruner could have came out of his cell, rang the intercom, and came out.
I want to know how long at this time. When did he go into that fetal position in the trash? The last time you claim anybody saw him was about 7:40. And after that, apparently he went off the radar screen until 2 o'clock. When did he get into that trash?
Do not know.
Isn't it your job to know?
Well, like the rover or my pod deputy took a tray in there. When he picked the tray up, he did not tell me anything about Mr. Bruner.
Well, actually, it's not your pod deputy, it was another inmate. And they...
I mean, the pod worker.
And that's exactly what Mr. Ewell said. They came up and told you he's on the floor. He's not eating. He's sick. Get him help. Isn't that when you said he's faking it?
I did not tell anybody that he was faking it.
Well, did you ask somebody to go in and check him? Did you ask the inmate who got his tray? What was he doing?
I don't recall if I asked him or not. I know he brought the tray up and showed me it.
Approximately 1,400, I had inmates in Section C come up to the booth and say inmate Bruner's on the floor and not moving. What inmates were those?
I don't know which inmate came up.
So that's three, at least. You say inmates, that's more than one. Did you use the plural?
No.
Inmates, it says inmates. I had inmates in Section C come up to the booth and say that inmate Bruner is not moving. That's more than one, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But I don't recall who they were.
So now we've got at least 3 and maybe 4 inmates who have come up and said, he's not moving, he's in the cell, he's curled up in a fetal position. That didn't happen at 2 o'clock though, did it?
That's when the inmates came up and told me he was on the floor.
Well, actually they told you hours before, didn't they?
No, because it says, because that's what time they came up approximately by 1400 and told me he was on the floor.
Mm-hmm. Well, then when was he found? When did you log in your log when somebody was in the cell with him? I think it was at 2:21, didn't you?
Do you have my log there?
I think I do.
I think that's when I got a hold of my rover to come and do a check on him.
Here, let's take a look at it. So he was laying there how long? I mean, you said at 2 o'clock you were notified. This is in evidence. It's Exhibit 2. Is that 2:27?
That's when the whole section was saved.
Mm-hmm.
But 2:11 was when the rover came in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and again, I'm going to ask you, how long had he been on the floor? Did he just collapse to the floor? Or had he been there for hours? What were his signs and symptoms?
It says that approximately 2 o'clock is when the inmates came up and told me he was on the floor.
No, I realize that. I'm asking you, did you determine how long he had been on the floor?
No.
So, of course, when you called your rover, because you didn't run out to see him, he came back and you said, how long has he been there, right?
No, I did not.
Did you talk to him and ask him how he is?
I don't recall if I did or not.
Did you ask him if he was breathing?
He would have said something if he wasn't breathing, or call a code 1 if he wasn't breathing.
Well, why would he do that if he found him unconscious and he didn't say call code 1? What makes you think he'd tell you to call code 1 if he wasn't breathing? What would strike that? You don't call code 1 if you find an unconscious man curled up on the floor? That's like, you see that all the time, right?
I don't recall what my rover came in and said.
And nobody wrote it down either, did they?
In my report,
It says, Deputy Jameson went and helped Bruner to his bed. He carried him to the bed, didn't he?
what I saw of his report is that he carried him.
I'm asking you at the time. Did you say, what's going on in there? Or are you telling me he didn't tell you what happened?
I don't recall if he told me he carried him or not.
He said, inmate Bruner not doing good. Did he tell you he's lying there in a fetal position and I had to lift him up and he's unresponsive and he's in garbage?
I don't remember if he did or not.
You said, I call Sergeant Martinez of the situation. Well, how did you tell Sergeant Martinez about the situation if you didn't know anything about it because you'd never asked any questions about it?
I don't recall what I said to Deputy Jameson or what he's told me.
Martinez said he was never told that he was lying in a fetal position, and if he had been, he would have called a medical emergency immediately. Did you hear him say that?
Yes.
You admit you didn't tell him, isn't that right?
No, I'm not admitting that I didn't tell him. I'm admitting that I didn't know what Deputy Jameson said. I don't recall what he said.
He asked if mental health saw Bruner. You told him they hadn't come down yet, because they weren't going to come down until after 3 o'clock, right?
I don't know when mental health does their rounds.
So from 2 o'clock or before, you knew a man was lying in the cell who had been lifted off the floor from garbage, who was unresponsive, and you didn't do anything.
I let
Did
my
you?
sergeant know.
Well, you let your sergeant know. Thank you. Approximately 3 o'clock, the second shift came, and you told Deputy Tong what had been going on. In fact, I think your same words were, "He's not doing good." Correct?
I don't recall if I told him he's not doing good or what I told him.
And that's when all these other people came into the cell, and we've just gone over all their statements about how sick Mr. Bruner was, right?
Could you repeat that?
Are all these people who say how sick he was lying?
No, I'm not saying they're lying, no.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
I want to start at the middle, Mary, and go back to the beginning. You were asked if all these people were lying, right?
Yeah.
Now, there were people that came in. There was Deputy Hunt. There was a Deputy Jones who saw him up at the clinic, and Deputy Hunt helped transport him. You had Deputy Jameson, who was in looking at Mr. Bruner. You had Sergeant Johnson Wooten, and she was up and she saw Mr. Bruner. And none of those people, to your knowledge, called a Code 1 to get medical to come and see him right away, right?
Right.
Did you ever have any indication until you learned that Mr. Bruner had passed away that he had the sort of serious condition that might be fatal, that ultimately we learned that he had?
That he would. Could you repeat that?
Did you have any indication at any time, until much later, after Mr. Bruner had died, that he had a condition that was potentially fatal if emergency help was not provided?
No, I did not know.
It was just the opposite. When you saw him in the morning, for the period of time that he was out, he didn't look like an emergency, right?
Yes, he did.
And then you never saw him again.
Yeah. I never saw, he never did come back out.
And no one that you talked to described things to you about
This
him.
is your witness, so you really shouldn't be leading her.
All right, I'll see if I can correct it, Your Honor. Did anyone ever describe to you any condition about Mr. Bruner that caused you to believe that he had an emergency condition that is a serious condition where he needed to be seen by medical immediately?
No.
Okay. Now, let me back up. You started with the Sheriff's Department when?
June of 1998.
And before starting with the Sheriff's Department, you worked, as I think counsel talked about it, as a nurse's aide, is that right?
Yes.
When did you work as a nurse's aide, and what sort of work did you do?
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Are you asking what I was doing as a nurse?
When were you a nurse's aide?
About 6 years before.
The early to mid in 90s?
Yeah.
And where did you work as a nurse's aide?
Before I went to the jail or the detention office.
No, what facility or who was your employer?
St. Francis Hospital.
And a nurse's aide at St. Francis Hospital, when you were there, what sort of duties did you have?
Vital signs, taking their blood pressure, temperature, helping with bathing them, changing the beds, getting them up to walk.
Did you ever diagnose medical conditions?
No.
Did you ever treat any patients?
You like what you mean, changing dressings or stuff like that? No.
You were there literally as a nurse's aide, is that right?
Yes.
I guess what I'm wondering is, do you hold yourself out as having a lot of medical background and training and knowledge?
No.
Before you were a nurse's aide, where did you work?
I was in the military.
How long were you in the military?
4 years and 4 months.
What did you do in the military?
I was a hospital corpsman.
And what did you do as a hospital corpsman?
About the same thing as a nurse's aide, but we were able to draw blood back in there.
When you were in the military as a nurse's aide, or when you were, a nurse's corpsman, or when you were in working for Via Christi as a nurse's aide, do you remember ever having to deal with a patient that had meningitis?
Not that I recall of.
You remember dealing with a patient that had pneumonia?
I can't remember if I did or not.
Do you claim to have any background or training or experience or special knowledge about pneumonia, about meningitis?
No.
Your knowledge level on that, would it be pretty much the same as anybody non-trained medical person?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that stuff.
And where did you grow up?
Vermont.
How did you get to Wichita?
Married my husband. He lived here.
So you and your husband, you met, and that's what brought you to Wichita out of the military, right?
Yes.
Do you have any children?
I have 2.
And what are their names and ages?
My son, his name is John. My son's John. He's 22 now. And I have a daughter that's 18.
Is your daughter still in high school?
Yes, she's a senior this year.
Now, your husband, what does he do?
He's an electrician.
And who does he work for?
A&H.
Back in 2008, in March, let's see, your son and daughter and husband, you had been living with them?
Yes.
And how old was your son?
I think he was like 18.
And would he have still been in school?
Yeah, because he didn't graduate until 2009.
So he'd been in high school still?
Yes.
And your daughter, she would have still been in school as well, is right?
Yes.
Now, what sort of activities do you have outside of work, and then all the responsibilities you have as a mom and wife?
I'm a Girl Scout leader.
How long have you been in Girl Scouts?
Since my daughter was in kindergarten.
Is your daughter still in Girl Scouts?
This is her last year.
And what has your role been with your daughter as far as scouting?
I've been her leader, just helping her with her getting her badge work, or we go different places, camps, and different things like that.
Is hers the only troop that you'd have involvement with?
Counsel, are you going to tie this into any of the issues which were even related to this case in the slightest?
Well, Your Honor, I think that they are saying that this woman, with reckless disregard, ignored the health care of a human being, and they need to know a little bit about her.
Well, I think whether she was a Girl Scout leader is pressing the edges of remoteness way too far, so let's move.
All right. Thank you,
forward.
Your Honor. You got involved in working with the Sheriff's Department, you say, in July of 1998. What took you to the Sheriff's Department?
A friend of mine at the hospital, her brother works there, so she and I was going to go together and work at the jail, plus for more money.
And since you've been with the Sheriff's Department, what positions have you held?
Just a deputy, detention deputy.
Have you always been a detention deputy? Have you performed all the duties that detention deputies perform, that is, working in the various pods, working in booking, working as a rover, a movement deputy, all those various things?
Yes, I work as mass control, rovers, movements, mastered control, rovers, movements, working at rovers, movements, pod deputy. I work in booking, intake and release. Yeah.
And through scouting or otherwise, have you been involved in volunteer work where you help others? You're pausing. Maybe I didn't ask the question correctly. Through
Okay.
scouting or otherwise, have you been involved in voluntary work where you've helped others?
Scouting, we go to council in like different events that they might have. I help volunteer at different events with my daughter.
Now, I'm going to talk to you about some general principles. As a pod deputy in Pod 1, and we all agree that it's an indirect pod, are you able to see into the cells of inmates?
No, it's very hard to see into those cells.
So if you have an inmate that is laying on the floor or laying on the bunk, are you able to see them?
No.
And in particular, if we're talking about when you're in that pod and in that booth, if they are, can you hear an inmate who is in their cell?
No.
There is an intercom in the cell. Can you hear over the intercom?
Yeah, when they hit the button, we can hear them.
Okay. But to be clear, otherwise, if you have a ringing, or excuse me, if you have someone that's coughing, if you have someone that's making noise while vomiting, are those the sorts of things that you can hear when you're in the booth for people in individual cells?
No, you can't hear that.
Trying to bring this home, can you hear what goes on, or could you hear or see what was going on in Terry Bruner's cell on March 10 of 2008?
No.
So when you asked a series of questions about how long he had been in whatever position and how long he'd been sick, what information did you have available to you by your own personal observation of Mr. Bruner on March 10 of 2008?
I couldn't see into his room. I couldn't tell what was going on.
Yeah, which you could see, and you did see him earlier in that morning, right?
Yes.
Other than that morning, what direct information did you have where you had actually had eyes on Mr. Bruner to see what he was doing?
What I had when I was able to see him or
Yes,
not?
yes, ma'am.
I couldn't see him only that one time.
I'm going to ask you about the defendant's exhibit, the daily activity log. Let me pull it out here. I believe, Your Honor, it's Exhibit 403, but I always have to double check. That's the thing I did. It's Exhibit 407, Your Honor, is the daily activity log.
You're offering that now?
It's already been offered, Your Honor, and it's been admitted, I believe.
Yes, that's correct, Your Honor.
I want to go to the first page of this document and talk to you about it kind of quickly. It's showing that on 3/6, oh, there's the 3/6, that there is a Lisa Perez here out on the right. What does that signify?
That's the person that was in the pod that day.
So Lisa Perez was there starting late the evening of 3/6 and would have been there for any inmate who may have entered the pod then that morning of March 7. Is that right?
She usually goes from about 11 o'clock at night until 7 in the morning.
Okay. And Exhibit 403, which is the inmate log, we'll come back to it, but it would indicate that Mr. Bruner moved into on 3/7 at 4 in the morning. He was moved in from booking into pod 1. Is that right?
Yes.
So Lisa Perez would have been the first pod deputy to have some responsibility concerning Mr. Bruner in the pod, right?
Yes, she been the first one.
And then if we page through to the next page, or page, well, go through these pages one by one. We go through page 3, then there's a Lisa Price up here outside of 3708. So she'd be the next pod deputy, right?
Yeah, she started at about 7 in the morning.
So that's 2 pod deputies, and then the next one would be Rachel Gaines.
Yes.
That would be 3 pod deputies. Then Kevin Lovinger would be there. It looks like he, well, tell me, what does this show as? Can you tell from that?
Hold on. Looks
We'd
like
have to
it
work
came-
backwards, wouldn't we, and see that he came in as 3rd shift on 3/7.
Yes, about 11 o'clock.
Then we've got Lisa Perez again, right?
She looked like on the 8th. She looked like on the 8th.
Yeah. And then Timothy McMahon, he's there on the 8th in the morning, right?
Yes.
Then Bobby Hines is there, and it looks like he's there on the 8th in the 2nd shift.
Second shift, yes.
Then Abdul Smith, that's what,
Third shift.
of 2008. Then Mark Cook is 1st shift of 2000, or rather of March 9, right?
Yes.
Then we've got Daniel Safarik
And he looks to be, what, there, 3-9, that would be second shift, right?
Yes.
And then we've got March 9, and,
It's 11 o'clock.
okay, so that's Lisa Williams, right?
Yes.
And that brings us to you.
Yes.
Now, the jury can look through these logs, and they can see what mention is made of Mr. Bruner, right? If there is any mention.
Yes, they could look through that.
So they could see whether or not there had been any observations before your shift of inmates coming up and saying, look, we've got somebody who's horribly ill, of deputies saying, look, we've seen an individual that is horribly ill and sick. If they make that observation, it's supposed to be placed either on the log or the inmate, either on the DAL on the inmate or on the inmate log, right?
It could be on either one.
And between 3:07 and 3:10 on the inmate log, which was Exhibit 403, there's no indication of Mr. Bruder needing medical care or being sick or anything else like that. Is that right?
No, there isn't.
When you come to the pod and you buy the pod, what information do you have about the medical condition of an inmate in the pod?
Of what they having, like if they have.
Well, what do you know about any of the medical conditions of the inmates?
We don't know anything about them.
And there's a document that's been put into evidence 401, and that's what? What is that document?
Inmate summaries.
Is that something on the computer?
Yes.
And it talks about information up here in the alert box. Is that all you know that may potentially tell you about a person's medical condition?
Yes, that is it.
And then you've got scheduled events. Scheduled events might show if someone is supposed to go to medical or something to that effect, but if it's not scheduled that day, you don't have anything, right?
Yeah, we don't go back, like we get a sheet that's print off on first shift. We print off a medical sheet.
Just for that shift?
Yes, just for that shift.
So the information you had on Terry Bruner when you started your shift at March 10 about him was what?
I don't recall her saying anything to me about him.
You didn't know about his medical, you didn't know about how long he'd really been in the pod or any conditions that went on before, right?
No, nothing.
When you took over the pod or bought the pod, you'd do a head count?
Yes.
And what is a head count?
That's when I remember right back then, that's when we were walking around each section, just doing a quick head count while everybody's in their cell.
So you would walk by Terry Bruner's cell and look in, as well as walking by each one of the inmates in the pod.
We just walk by real quick, do a quick look to see if everybody's in their room.
And you've worked first shift a number of times?
I've started on first shift.
Okay. What's the usual position of an inmate when you do a head count on first shift?
Sometimes they're sleeping, they're on the bed sleeping, sometimes they're on the floor sleeping, sometimes they're standing up in front of the mirror or at their desk, or they're sitting up reading.
You don't note and you don't remember anything special about Terry Bruner when you did your head count, I take it?
No.
Then there are these, there's this NP meds. What is that?
That's what we have in the pods. All the pods have Tylenol, Advil, and Bear. That's if an inmate has a headache or anything, they can come up and ask for Tylenol or Advil.
So you have to inventory those and count them at the outset to make sure that you can show how many are used during the course of a shift?
Yeah, if anybody, yeah, we just keep track of what we have at the beginning.
In the exhibit, Henry Tong made the same inventory for non-prescription drugs, and he has what? How many Tylenol? 4?
4.
Advil 11,
Yes.
and Bear 50?
Yes.
You had, what, 1 more Tylenol? Looks like 5 more Advil and 1 more Bear, right?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Means that inmates have come out during the daytime and asked for Tylenol and Advil and Bear.
So you were allowing inmates medications on March 10. Now, let's focus on, we already have a little bit, these are your notes that you would have entered and saved at 8:16 concerning the linen exchange, right?
Yes, that's everything.
Oops. And what they show is first call for linen at 7:19. What does that mean?
Means what it probably meant was that the Rovers were calling me on the radio saying linen exchange is on the way to pod 1. So I made an announcement to the pod, first call for linen, start getting up, strip your beds, get it ready.
And are inmates, at least in theory, required to change their linen?
They're supposed to, yes.
And if they don't change their linen, if they refuse, is that something that they can be punished for?
They can be locked down for 72 hours.
Do you know the reason for that rule?
Because that way we make sure everybody gets their linen. Sometimes they don't want to come out and change at all. And then they want to try to get linen later that day because they want to sleep in. They want to stay in their rooms and sleep instead of getting up and doing linen exchange.
Are inmates always punished for not changing their linen?
A lot of times, yeah. Not all the time. Sometimes we don't get them locked down.
This day was March 10, 2008. What day of the week was that?
That was a Monday.
And how does the workload in Pod 1 compare on a Monday to any other day of the week?
We're very busy on Mondays in Pod 1.
What are you doing in Pod 1 on Mondays that makes you very busy as opposed to other days?
You're doing linen exchange. After that, you get them up for the showers. Also, you picking up personal linen, which is when they come and ask for a bag to wash their socks, underwear, T-shirts. We hand those out. We hand out the razors. Also, Monday's family visit day. So a lot of times inmates are up in the morning because they want to get in the shower before they got to go to visit at 9 o'clock. Also, we have clinic calling us all day for different inmates. We have pro-visit going on, where they go see their attorneys. I don't know, I can't remember if we had chapel that day or the afternoon. And we have other classes going on.
So the clinic calls, what are they calling for?
They call for their people that they want to see for like blood pressures, who signed up for sick call.
So they may have people that are on lists and they're saying, send them up now.
They call for their people
And how do they reach you?
by phone.
If you wanted to call and talk to the clinic, is there a phone available to you to do that, to call them
In the pod,
in the pod booth?
yes.
And is it a kind of on a speed dial? Or do you have to dial?
We have to dial it.
Okay. But that number is something that you memorized?
After working there, yeah.
Okay, you've got it written down in the working area and you are able to type it up easily. Is it difficult to call the clinic?
No.
When the clinic were to call down, if it were to call down saying, I want someone, or an inmate, is it easy to say to them, if you wanted to, look, I also have another inmate that needs to be seen? That's something that could be brought up?
Yeah, it could bribe.
Okay. We've got between 7:21 and 7:52 is when deputies are in with the pod with the linen, and then deputies are out of the pod with the linen. And so is it during that time frame that Mr. Bruner is out and is in the pod that required you to call and get assistance?
Yeah, that's when he was, that's when I
Now,
called.
at this time, 7 in the morning, you'd been there for, what, about an hour and a half, is that right, in the pod?
About maybe 30 minutes.
Oh, 30 minutes, I'm sorry. Well, no, you got there maybe, when do you take over? Was it around 7:04?
It's around 7-ish, a little before maybe. Excuse me.
And during that time frame, no inmate, or did an inmate come up to you and say, look, Mr. Bruner hasn't been eating?
No, not that I remember.
That would have been during the linen exchange process. And when that's happening, what are the inmates doing?
They're getting linens and going back to their rooms.
Would you let all the inmates out from the whole pod in this instance, all 37, and send them?
No.
Okay,
No.
what do you do?
Like in Section C there, and every deputy does it a little different.
Okay, how do you do?
The way I do it, like the top half, like there's like 6 up there, I would unlock that door, let them out.
Talking about the mezzanine area?
Yeah, like the mezz level. I probably would let the first 6 out.
You talking about Section C?
Yeah, C.
You're talking about Section C here, and the 6 you talk about are those ones here.
I'm not sure which one.
Do you remember which one you got out first?
No, I don't remember. I know I usually do it, especially if depends on how many deputies are in the gym, because I look for their safety too. So I don't let so many inmates out at a time. So once the inmates start going out to the gym, if I have 3 coming back, I might let 3 more go. So I'm hitting buttons all trying to, keep the flow moving, everybody moving, so we get linen. The doors, hitting the doors open.
So if I've got an inmate in 124 mezzanine, what you're doing is you call them, when it's ready, hit a button, and they go out, and you're supposed to change.
Yes.
And you remember starting at the top level, and then working to the lower level?
I really don't remember which way I did it.
But it was during that exchange where you've got inmates coming in and coming out that's when you observed Mr. Bruner, right?
Yes.
And you were asked to prepare a report, which you did, and it's in evidence as part of Plaintiff's Exhibit 2. And that's where you stated back on March 11 your best recollection of what you saw when Mr. Bruner came out, right?
Yes.
After Mr. Bruner went in his cell, and the two deputies helped him back in the cell, you didn't see Mr. Bruner again, did you?
No, he did not come back out.
If you had done a round, had time to do that, and seen Mr. Bruner, you could only do that if there was a rover in the booth, right?
Yes.
If a deputy leaves the booth without someone in the booth, they can't get back in, can they?
No, they cannot get back in.
So we could look in the log, and it's only when we see we see Marque's RV1 is in, that there's the possibility for you to either have him do a visual inspection or for you to do a visual inspection, right?
Yeah, walking around.
Yeah. And is it, back then, was it unusual during a first shift, particularly on a Monday, not to be able to do an inspection?
Yes, it is.
Did you ever get in trouble for not doing the inspection?
No.
There was a policy that says you're supposed to do it once an hour. Did your sergeant that's reviewing your logs ever criticize you for not doing it once an hour?
No.
After the Lennon exchange, there's this highlighted part in Exhibit 2, or portion of Exhibit 2. It says, inmate Brett Schneider came to the booth and told me that inmate Bruner was not eating any of the food since he came into the pod. Now, I looked up when inmate Bruner came into the pod, and he came in, he gives the date of 3608 from out of county. Why did you look up when he came into the pod?
That way, what I see, if I can get a hold of Sergeant Martinez to let him know what's kind of going on. Now I can just kind of see how he did at lunchtime.
And it indicates that inmate Bruner had not been eating any food since he came into the pod. If you had been told that in addition to not eating food, he had been coughing and vomiting, was that supposed to find its way to the report?
If I would probably written it down if I had known.
Well, if you'd known that he was coughing and vomiting, if he was, during that time frame, and walking lethargically and so forth, isn't that something that you were trained to put in your report?
Yes.
But you did put in that he wasn't eating in your report, didn't you?
Yes.
And then the next entry is when Sergeant Martinez came into the pod, I told him, Abel, inmate Bruner, I think that's about, right?
I think, yes.
Okay.
I think I've...
Now, did you lie to the sergeant? I mean, did you lie to Sergeant Martinez and not tell him things that you knew about Bruner?
No, I didn't.
Hold anything back intentionally from Sergeant Martinez?
I told him what, it's like right there in the report, I told him what I would have found out.
How would it have assisted your job or assisted you to have refused to tell Sergeant Martinez the full amount of what you knew?
repeat that?
Sure. Wasn't the easiest thing to do when you saw Sergeant Martinez to tell him everything that you knew about
Yeah.
Bruner? Okay. Was there any reason that you had or know of as to why you wouldn't tell him everything you knew about Bruner?
There was no reason why I wouldn't.
Now, you had not called the clinic about Mr. Bruner before you saw Sergeant Martinez. Why is that?
Because I don't remember when I was told by the inmate when he told me about that.
Okay. You didn't call the clinic back around, let's see, that would have been around 7:21 or 7:52. You didn't call the clinic then about Mr. Bruner. Why is that?
Not sure. Probably because I was going to keep and just see what's going to happen today, and I got busy getting everything else.
Well, what did you know about Mr. Bruner back at the time that the linen was going on? You had that one observation. Tell us what you remember about him.
Confused.
How was that different than if
Also,
it was?
can I jump in here? We have a juror that would like a break, and I
Oh, I'm
think
sorry.
that'd be good for all of us. So if you could hold that thought. Members of the jury, let's just take a quick 10-minute recess and be back ready to go at that time. Court's in recess.
All right.